Okay, so this starts part 14 of passing your check ride in a Robinson R44. And what I'm going to do here is just a series of just rapid fire question and answers, a little bit of commentary here and there when it needs to be, but mostly just I'm going to ask the question, give you the answer. Ask the question, give you the answer. So let's get started. I'm going to cover some special emphasis items first, and one of the special emphasis items has to do with how do you avoid colliding with another aircraft or object. There's several things that you can include in that answer. Make sure that your windshield is good and clean, that you can see out of the thing. VFR flight following is another really good idea. Take appropriate action. If it appears a collision is imminent, you take the appropriate action that's turning to the right and consistent with the right-of-way rules. And then the last thing in this question would be to avoid the flow of fixed-wing traffic. And if you've never read it, you ought to at least one time read Advisory Circular 99-66B. 99-66B. I think the last update was in 2019. But what that advisory circular concerns is right-of-way rules and traffic patterns. And there's a statement, and pay particular attention to section 12.1, which deals with rotorcraft avoiding the flow of fixed-wing traffic. And there's a statement for both helicopters and gyroplanes that says that landings off the runways must, and it doesn't say maybe, it says must avoid the flow of fixed-wing traffic. So if you've never read that advisory circular, you ought to take at least one time read Advisory Circular 99-66B. Okay, and then again, scanning for aircraft. How do you scan for aircraft? Well, what the FAA wants to actually hear you say is that you go 10 degrees at a time for 1 second at a time scanning for aircraft. Now, nobody's actually going to do that, because to go from looking this direction all the way around to here would take 18 seconds. Nobody's actually going to scan that way. But that's the answer they want to hear come out of your mouth, is scanning 10 degrees at a time for 1 second at a time, scanning for other aircraft. Okay, another special emphasis item. If it looks like you have an imminent head-on collision with an aircraft coming right at you, how do you avoid the other aircraft? And the answer is you turn to the right. Just remember, all the right-of-way rules concern the word right. All right, the aircraft on the right has the right-of-way. If you turn to deviate, you turn to the right to avoid the other aircraft. Next question, what is wake turbulence? Wake turbulence are the vortices created by wings producing lift. And it doesn't matter whether it's an airplane or a helicopter. Right? All right, once those vortices are generated, which direction do they move? And the answer is down and out. Down and out, okay? Next question, if you have to depart behind a heavy aircraft that you're expecting is going to produce significant wing vortices, how do you do it? Well, you simply climb out, you try to depart the runway, lift off before they lift off, and stay above their flight path. All right. If you can't stay above their flight path, then you want to turn upwind. Turn to the right if the wind's coming from the right. You want to make that upwind turn. So stay above their flight path on the way out. If that's not possible, then turn upwind. All right. Next is you're going to land behind a heavy aircraft that you're expecting to encounter producing significant vortices. So how do you land behind a heavy aircraft you're expecting that's producing significant vortices? And the answer is, again, stay above their flight path and land past where they actually touch wheels down. Right? Next question, what marks a closed runway or closed taxiway? And the answer is a big yellow X. And here I'll show you as a picture on that here so you can see it. Here's a closed runway, big X on the end of it. Here's a closed taxiway, okay? All right, next question. Actually, and by the way, on the big yellow X is on there. If it's a permanently closed runway, there'll be a large yellow X painted every 1,000 feet along that runway or taxiway, right? If it's temporarily closed, it's just going to be a single X on each, a single yellow X on each end of the runway. So next question, what marks a closed helipad? And it's a big yellow X again. Here, I'll show you a picture one. Here's an example of a closed helipad here with a big yellow X on it. So anytime you see a big yellow X on something, it's closed, either temporarily or permanently. Next question is, what does a hold short line look like? All right, a hold short line is a series of two yellow lines, solid yellow double lines, and two segmented yellow double lines. I'll show you a picture of that. Here's an example of a hold short line here. All right. Okay. The next question there is, okay, so which side of that line can you cross from without clearance? All right. So you can cross from the segmented line across, say, off the runway onto a taxiway without specific clearance. However, to go the other way, to cross the double solid yellow line, you must have clearance to cross. Any solid line, you must have clearance. There's also a, here, I'll show you a picture. There's probably one here. Yeah, here's a line that marks the end of a movement versus non-movement area. So you see a solid yellow line and a segmented yellow line, okay? For you to cross that line from the solid section onto the movement area, from a non-movement area to a movement area, you're going to have that painted on the runway, and you must have clearance to cross that solid from the solid yellow line side. Next question, you're flying along low level for whatever reason and you have to cross a power line. Where do you cross a power line at? And the answer is at the pole, because if you're above the pole, you're above the wire, okay? Next question, when do you use a pre-printed checklist? And the answer is with every flight, with every pre-flight, with every startup, and with every shutdown. That sounds like a stupid question, but that you'll likely get asked that question. All right, next, what documents are you required to carry on your person to be pilot in command? And there's three of them. First is your pilot's license, second is your medical, and third is a government-issued photo ID. All right. Next question, what four documents are required to be on board the aircraft? And this is the AROW mnemonic, A-R-O-W. A is airworthiness certificate. R is registration, and those two things are contained in a plastic document holder down usually on the left side, down by your foot. The next two, O and W, are operating limitations and weight and balance. Those two items are contained within the POH of the aircraft. So therefore the next question is the POH required to be on board the aircraft for the aircraft to be considered airworthy? And that is yes. All right. Next question, is the POH specific to the aircraft by serial number? And the answer is yes. You can't replace it with another POH out of another R44. Next question, how long is your medical good for? Your medical, a second class medical is good for 1 year as a second class medical and 4 additional years as a third class medical if it was issued at the time you were age 40, or actually under the age of 40. If over the age of 40, a second class medical is good for 1 year, and then 1 additional year is a third class medical. Third class medical is good for 5 years if it's issued when you're under 40, and 2 years if it's issued if you're over 40. Next question, does your pilot certificate ever expire? No, there is no expiration date on your pilot certificate. Next question, what are the requirements for currency? Within the preceding 90 days, you must have logged 3 takeoff and landings if during the day, if you're going to take a passenger during the day, and if you're going to take a passenger at night, within the preceding 90 days, you must have logged 3 takeoff and landings at night. Next question, are you required to have an FCC radio telephone operator's permit? And the answer is no, not to fly within the continental United States. You do, however, need one if you fly internationally. So if you go from the U.S. to Canada, U.S. to Mexico, U.S. to the Bahamas, you have to have a radio telephone operator's permit. There's my original one from 1978. So they were just a piece of paper back then. Okay, next question is which hours are required to be logged? And the hours that are required to be logged are those hours that prove you meet the requirements for a certificate or rating, the hours showing your biennial flight reviews, and then the hours to prove currency. Okay, next question. Which instruments are required for day VFR flight and for night VFR flight? And there's several mnemonics around people use. I've seen ones, A, tomato, flames. And that one actually works for helicopters as well, except for the E in tomato and flames is basically you don't need an ELT. So I usually just use the three instruments that you fly the aircraft with, which is airspeed indicator, magnetic compass, and altimeter, and then everything else the system's monitoring: oil pressure, oil temperature. You have to have a fuel gauge for each tank. You have to have a manifold pressure gauge if applicable. You have to have a tachometer for each engine. You have to have seat belts with a shoulder harness. And then at night you have to add some lights. And for just for non-commercial activity, you do not need a landing light. If you're taking your commercial check ride, then yes, you do need a landing light for commercial operations. The other lighting that you need is navigation or position lights, and number two, an anti-collision light of some sort. It's usually a strobe these days. So. Okay, next question. Per the Robinson Handbook, there are some required equipment that must be functional for you to be able to dispatch a flight with a Robinson helicopter. So what equipment would that be? And the answer is, and again this goes back to the GOL H mnemonic, right? And the answer is G, GOL governor, O is OAT gauge, A is the alternator, L is the low rotor RPM horn and light, and H is hydraulics. So let's look at each one of those and why. All right, so that would be the next question. Why does the governor need to be functional? Well, that's pretty self-explanatory. To control the RPMs within the specific range. OAT. Why is the OAT gauge required? Well, there's several charts that you need to be able to function or be able to successfully do the chart. You need to know what the outside air temperature is. And those charts are the limit manifold pressure chart, the VNE chart, and again those are above your head on the older aircraft, down on the T-bar in front and the newer aircraft, and the OGE and the IGE chart. You also need to know what the outside air temperature is as to whether you need to apply carburetor heat or not. Next one on the list is the alternator. That generates the question, what two systems on board the aircraft are powered electrically and fairly critical, and that therefore the alternators are required? And the answer is the tachometer and the governor. They're both electric. They're not mechanical. They're electric. So those two systems are electric, and therefore the alternator must be functioning correctly. L, low rotor RPM horn and light. Again, pretty self-explanatory: to maintain the RPM, or to help you realize when your RPM is not within the normal range, and to alert you of low rotor RPM. H, hydraulics. All right, and why do the hydraulics need to be working? Well, again, the hydraulics need to be functioning correctly to be able to fly the aircraft well. That leads to the next question is, all right, well, what happens if your hydraulics are working intermittently? What are you supposed to do? And the answer is turn off the hydraulics and fly the aircraft with the hydraulics off. Okay, you're flying the aircraft with hydraulics off. How are you supposed to land the aircraft? And the answer is in a slight run-on landing, right? Don't try to land it from a hover. It's much more difficult to land it from a hover than it is to just do a little 1 or 2 mile an hour run-on landing and set the aircraft down. Next question, what do you do if you have inoperative instruments on board the aircraft? First thing you have to do is make sure that that inoperative instrument is not either on the FAA's generic list of required instruments or on the Robinson's list of required instruments that have to be working for the aircraft to be flown. If it's not on either one of those two, then you can operate the aircraft without that instrument being functional. But you have three choices. Somebody says, okay, you've checked it, that aircraft, that instrument, let's say Artificial Horizon, is not on the list of required equipment, either on the FAA's list or on Robinson's list in the POH. So now, what are your three options that you have to deal with that inoperative instrument? And those three options are repair it, number two, remove it, or number three, placard it inop, and you're supposed to deactivate it either by pulling the breaker to it or have the mechanic actually disconnect it if it's electric or whatever. So, next question, how do you get a special flight permit or ferry permit? And the answer is, you obtain it from the FSDO where the aircraft is sitting, okay? And so what you have to do is notify the FSDO where the aircraft is sitting, what the situation is, why you need the special ferry permit. They either will or won't issue the ferry permit. If they do, it has to be co-signed or signed off by at least an ANP, and then you're allowed to move the aircraft in accordance with the ferry permit that's issued. Next question, what is an AD note or an airworthiness directive? All right. An airworthiness directive is issued by the FAA, and the key point is mandatory compliance. It has to do with a lot of different things, but usually it has to do with a component on board the aircraft that needs to be replaced or upgraded. That's an airworthiness directive, and I showed you guys how to look them up and all of that. But an airworthiness directive is issued by the FAA, mandatory compliance. Next question. What's the maintenance requirements for the R44 that you're taking your test in today? Right? And the answer is it must have both a 100-hour inspection and an annual inspection. Right? So the 100-hour inspections, what mechanic can perform the 100-hour inspections? And it can be just an A&P can perform the 100-hour inspections. How about the annual inspection? Who has to be the one to do the annual inspection? And it must be an A&P with IA privileges, all right? With IA privileges. Okay, next topic is going to be on weather. Now, weather is pretty complicated. It's hard to come up with specific questions, but here's some things you need to be able to do. Number one, you need to be able to interpret a METAR and a TAF in the raw form, okay? Not the decoded form, but the raw form. You need to be able to read one of those. You need to be able to read a winds and temp aloft chart, all right? You need to know what the information is contained on those charts. And you need to be able to read and interpret a prog chart, all right? So those three things you definitely need to know, because likely they're going to give you examples of each and just point out different things on the chart and say, what is this, okay? All right, so those three things you want to be well versed in. All right, next thing we're going to look at is AWOS and ASOS versus ATIS, all right? And the question is probably likely going to go, okay, AWOS, yeah, the airport that you're flying into lists an AWOS or ASOS frequency. Is it required that you listen to that on the way in? And the answer is no, it's not required. It's highly recommended that you listen to it. You need to know which way the wind's blowing and what's going on at the airport, but it's not required. Next question, how about ATIS? If there's an ATIS frequency listed for that airport, is that required that you listen to it? And the answer is yes. You got to get the alpha identifier, information alpha, information bravo, Charlie Delta, whatever, and you tell the tower that when you make first contact with the tower, you give them the information identifier for that. Next questions are going to have to do with SIGMETs and AirMETs. So number one is, which one is more significant? Well, a SIGMET is much more significant than an AirMET. A SIGMET affects all aircraft, all right? AirMET affects usually lighter aircraft or aircraft with limited equipment and pilot training and that sort of thing. So let's first look at SIGMET. So what kind of questions are you going to get for a SIGMET? So the obvious question is, what is a SIGMET? What kind of conditions would a SIGMET tell you about? And those kind of conditions would be severe icing, not associated with a thunderstorm, severe turbulence, not associated with a thunderstorm, sandstorms or blowing dust storms, which decrease the visibility to less than 3 miles, and then volcanic ash. So those are the things that a SIGMET is going to tell you about, right? Now there's also convective SIGMETs, right? Anytime you hear the word convective, that means thunderstorm. So why the hell don't they change the name of it to thunderstorm SIGMET? Would seem to make a lot more sense to me, but they still leave it convective SIGMET. So let's talk about convective SIGMET. Okay, so what will a convective SIGMET be issued for? Number one, surface winds of 50 knots or greater, right? Number two, hail at the surface of 3/4 inch in diameter or greater. Third thing is tornadoes. Yeah, I'd kind of like to know about a tornado if one's in the area. And then finally, thunderstorms, several permutations of thunderstorms as well. So convective SIGMET is going to be those things, right? Okay, next will be AirMETs, and there's 3 types of AirMETs, right? Sierra, Tango, and Zulu, right? And here's how I like to remember them. AirMET Sierra, just remember, it starts with an S for Sierra, stands for shitty weather conditions, and it's IFR conditions and mountain obscuration for an AirMET Sierra. AirMET Tango, remember T, Tango, for turbulence. AirMET Tango has to do with moderate turbulence, right? And also winds greater than 30 knots at the surface, right? And also low-level wind shear. Now, low-level wind shear doesn't mean just a little bit of wind shear. It means wind shear at a low level or near the ground that could affect you during takeoff and landing, right? And then finally, AirMET Zulu, which has to do with icing, specifically moderate icing, and also has to do with the freezing levels. So Airmets are Sierra, Tango, and Zulu, and that's the easiest way I usually remember them. All right, so let's try a few questions on SIGMETs and airmets. How about you have surface winds that are between 30 and 50 knots at the surface. What would that be? That would be issued as what? And that would be an airmet Tango, right? Turbulence, winds above 30 knots, all right, but not quite 50 knots. Okay, how about there's surface winds now are greater than 50 knots on the surface? What would that be issued as? And that would be a convective SIGMET, right? All right, how about you've got dust storms, we're out in the Dust Bowl or whatever, and you've got a dust storm that's come up and its visibility is less than 3 miles. So what would that be issued as? And that would be a SIGMET, all right? Okay, how about you've got moderate icing in the forecast, and that would be issued as what? And that would be an airmet Zulu, okay? Okay, so again, kind of get those straight in your mind, and you should be able to field any questions that they come up with on SIGMETs and airmets. Okay, so we'll continue this on in part 15 where we take up airspace and continue on then. And again, if you haven't done so far, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks.